Hey everyone, Richard from Digital Foundry here, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at the games, the multi-platform games that show the biggest differentials between Xbox One X and PlayStation 4 Pro. So yeah, effectively the best multi-platform games for your 4K screen. And joining me to discuss the games in question, David Beerton.
Hey Rich.
How's it all going?
Yeah, not too bad actually.
So yeah, I mean obviously we've been big fans of the PlayStation 4 Pro over the last year, but one thing that has been a bit of an issue is that, well, many of the games just haven't really scaled to anything like 4K resolution. Now back in the day, Xbox One got a lot of heat for running at 720p in the 1080p era, and now effectively we have the Pro offering a lot of 1440p games on a 4K screen, so it's basically the same resolution differential really. So Xbox One X, does it make a difference? I think by and large it does, and well, let's talk about the games in question. Where shall we begin?
Okay, well let's begin with, I think, Battlefront 2. That had a pretty big upgrade across the board, more than just resolution when I was sampling it on the X.
Now that's an interesting one obviously, because the Frostbite engine, well, it's kind of ubiquitous across the EA line, and DICE, you know, the makers of Frostbite at one point, they were obviously in charge of Battlefront 2, and there is a big differential here.
Yeah, that's right. You know, on PlayStation 4 Pro we're looking at maximum of around 1440p in terms of the resolution, whereas Xbox One X targets 2160p full 4K. But both have like a dynamic resolution in play. But I guess the point is that Xbox One X sticks a lot closer to its 2160p, you know, around 1800p, whereas PS4 Pro can go to about, you know, 1360p. So the difference on screen is pretty huge on a 4K display. You're looking at a much sharper presentation on the One X that's closer to what you'd expect from that big bump in resolution, whereas on the Pro it's an improvement over 1080p, but it's not giving you that sharp sort of 4K clarity, as it were.
I mean, the peak resolutions there, I mean, it is 1440p versus 2160p.
Yeah.
So again, if we kind of scale up from the kind of current gen 1080p standard, that is the same difference between 720p and 1080p. So yeah, that was quite a turn up for the books, I think, because, you know, DICE know what they're doing. They know what they're doing with hardware. So to see a 2.25x increase in resolution on Xbox One X, that kind of surprised us.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting that, and it makes a big difference because on Pro I found that image quality is probably better suited to like a 1080p screen with the downsampling in comparison.
Right.
But on top of the resolution, what I was more surprised to see is there's a whole host of extra graphical sort of bling over PS4 Pro that kind of brings the One X closer to the PC experience,
okay,
which I wasn't expecting. So you get like the high quality textures, improved normal maps, and things like high resolution reflections, shadow quality is improved, along with tweaks to ambient occlusion. So you're really getting a big bump across the entire feature set beyond just the pixel count, which is even more impressive, I think, when you see the difference between the two.
Okay, so I played this game when it launched, and yeah, I was quite impressed with the way it looked on my LG B6. HDR support built in as well. Can't say I was too impressed with that, but in terms of the clarity of the image, you know, I didn't feel shortchanged there, even though it is dynamic. It's not 2160p all the time. But yeah, side by side with the Pro, clear advantage here. And bearing in mind that there is like a 43% compute advantage, and obviously the memory bandwidth advantage. I mean, I did expect an increase, but I didn't expect to see a 2.25 times increase in pixel count. Okay, so let's move on to the next game. What are we talking about here?
Right, so next up we've got Wolfenstein 2.
Now this is another one that is showing peak 1440p on Pro and peak 2160p on Xbox One X.
Yep, the same big differential again between the two.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see the way this is sort of turning out in two major engines, both of which phenomenally optimized for AMD hardware, and there is this huge bump between them. Now, you know, again, you know, I'm sort of thinking about the compute differential, the memory bandwidth differentials between the two systems. I'm not seeing a 2.25 times increase in capability. So I guess there's a sort of question that we need to go out and find an answer to there. But yeah, you can see that when you look at the footage side by side, there is a distinct blurriness to the PlayStation 4 Pro version. It just holds up a lot better on the Xbox One X. One thing I will say though, performance isn't that great on either of them.
Yeah, it doesn't 60 FPS target obviously, but compared to the first Wolfenstein there's more drops. It's kind of like a 50 to 60 FPS experience in those heavy shootouts, and that's kind of like on both consoles. From what I understand, the reason why Xbox One X doesn't always get to 60 FPS more closely is a lot of those scenes are more CPU, or appear to be more CPU limited, so you don't get the dynamic scaler kicking into lower resolution, and even if it did, that's not necessarily the bottleneck for why you're not always getting 60 frames per second. So it's kind of interesting in that respect that even if we do have like a dynamic scaler, it's not always going to necessarily give you a better performance even on the One X.
Yeah, and going back to Battlefront, that actually had slightly worse performance on Xbox One X than the Pro. Okay, so let's talk about the next game, Rise of the Tomb Raider. Now, we still haven't posted our full analysis of the final game there, but by and large, what we saw in the demo still holds up in the final code. So let's talk about that one. Obviously, we have the high frame rate mode. I didn't like this one at all because it has tearing, which the Pro version doesn't. Then we have the enriched 4K mode, which is a kind of sparse rendering solution. Not quite sure if it's checkerboarding or not, but the bottom line is that the equivalent mode on PlayStation 4 Pro runs at 1080p. And then we have what John says, and he's played this game more than anyone, is the most consistent performer, and that is actually the native 4K mode. Now, we have got some additional analysis here. A lot of you guys have been waiting for this one. It is the Geothermal Valley. And yeah, pretty good show here. We've got checkerboard 4K on the Pro on the left here, and we've got native 4K Xbox One X on the right here. So effectively, we're looking at twice the resolution and higher frame rate, better locked to 30 FPS on the Xbox One X. So yeah, we were kind of worried about that one in terms of the heavier scenes, but it seems to be holding up. We do still intend to go back to that one for a full analysis, but in the here and now, I do think it is a pretty profound improvement over the Pro. Okay, so the next title that we've got here in our lineup of Xbox One X prime performers, Shadow of War, Shadow of Mordor as we like to call it. So Dave, what's the situation there?
Right, well, this is kind of an interesting one because it's a game that gives you lots of different options. So you have basically a dynamic resolution option on Xbox One X. So in terms of like the resolution upgrade, Xbox One X, the maximum you can get out of the game is 2160p native 4K, or if you select the dynamic resolution, this can drop as low. So I think it's 1830p versus about 1620p on PS4 Pro.
I mean, you know, from my perspective, I have a kind of window, an acceptable window of resolution where it doesn't really matter that much if it drops. So, you know, between 1800p to 2160p, generally speaking, that seems to be a sort of area that holds up well on a 4K screen. And when you drop below that, things start to sort of show up a bit more. So again, it is a situation where Pro is, you know, not bad at all, but it's just not quite within that window that we like to have for a decent 4K presentation.
Exactly, and I think above that, what makes a bigger difference is the improvements to texture quality and filtering, which at the moment you see the Xbox One X, just there's so much more detail across the environments, and you just don't get that on the Pro. It appears a bit more sort of blurry and sort of soupish, especially when you get sort of further away, and I think that kind of makes the difference a bit bigger than just the pixel count alone. It's the detail you see.
Exactly, and that all comes from the 4K assets that can only apparently fit into the extra memory that the Xbox One X has.
Exactly, yeah, and that's another thing with PS4 Pro. You don't get, or developers don't get, that extra sort of 4 gigabytes of RAM to play with if they do have the assets available.
Yeah, it's an extra 512 megs there, which is, I guess, okay for scaling up frame buffers and whatnot, but if you're looking to include PC's top quality assets, it's not going to happen there. Okay, next up, Hitman. Now this is a pretty interesting one because it tops out at 1440p on the PlayStation 4 Pro, but the X does have a 1440p mode, but it also has a full 4K mode.
Yep, so what I find interesting there is the actual 1440p mode on the X, the performance mode. The actual level of visual quality is identical to the PS4 Pro running in the quality mode.
Right.
So you're getting the increased frame rate with sort of PS4 Pro's highest quality visuals. But of course, there's a resolution mode as well, which takes you above that all the way up to 4K, but obviously targeting 30 frames per second.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of straight scaling, Pro at 1440p with an unlocked frame rate does run faster than Xbox One X with an unlocked frame rate in its 4K mode. So you're not getting, straight leveling of performance there between 1440 and 2160. But, it holds up at 2160 on the Xbox One X, and there's so much detail in this game that I think you're getting a great experience here. And of course, you do have the option for a mode that, well, it doesn't quite sort of lock to 60 frames per second, but it holds up fairly well.
Exactly, yeah, and you get the same bling that PS4 Pro in its highest quality mode has, so that's a pretty nice boost if you want the higher frame rate.
Okay, and next up, Ghost Recon Wildlands. Now, we didn't go into this one with huge expectations, but it's pretty awesome, isn't it?
Yeah, I was quite surprised. Obviously, you get the resolution boost again. It's 1440p on the Pro, not really surprising there, but Xbox One X goes up to 1800p, which gives you a nice bit of extra sharpness. But I think what's I found more impressive is that there's a lots of extra graphical upgrades again that you get over the Pro. So the geometry detail is expanded on the distance, the tessellation. You're getting high quality textures for terrain detail, extra texture filtering, you get a higher level of that. So you're getting a lot more clarity beyond just raw sharpness. Again, it's kind of a Star Wars Battlefront 2 situation where you get extra settings from the PC on the X, whereas PS4 Pro, you kind of don't in that respect.
And the performance is pretty good on both, but yeah, you're getting that extra bling, you're getting the 1800p resolution, you're getting TAA, which works pretty well, I generally tend to think, with titles that are sort of just within that 1800p to 2160p window. So yeah, I think you do get a really good 4K presentation with Ghost Recon Wildlands, even though it isn't native 4K.
Yeah, I think it definitely comes across as sharp enough to be convincing from regular viewing distances, and yeah, in performance, smooth 30 FPS, didn't really encounter any problems there with that. So
now, there are a great many more titles that we could discuss here, but I think these are the ones that are showing the biggest improvements between Xbox One X and PlayStation 4 Pro. But there are a fair few titles that kind of don't.
Yeah, kind of miss the mark, don't they?
And the bottom line is that different game engines stress hardware in different ways, and the Pro actually holds up pretty well on quite a few games that we've tested. And yeah, let's start by taking a look at Titanfall 2.
Okay, so Titanfall 2, this kind of surprised us out of the gate when we first played it, because initially we weren't actually getting a boost over PS4 Pro when we first saw it. I remember you looked at my footage and was like, hey, it's looking blurrier on Xbox One X, which was a bit unusual, and I was kind of seeing some scenes that were higher that actually went up to 2160p or just above, and then other scenes were actually dropping lower than Pro in the initial patch down to I think 1296p.
And there were some lower performance issues as well, which was a big
right.
surprise there. And yeah, put more time into it, it didn't look right. Now, it did get a patch, and by and large the resolution is now higher than the Pro, but in terms of your basic living room experience, I find it really hard to tell the two of them apart.
Yeah, and what I've noticed is that in demanding scenes you're normally getting around 1440p on the X, which is Pro's maximum resolution. So even though it does obviously go above in scenes that aren't taxing, whenever you're blowing lots of stuff up, then you're not really getting a massive resolution differential between them. You do get things like more complex geometry, which is the one upgrade you get outside of pixel counts that's taken from PC's ultra settings. And performance is cleared up as well, so the cutscenes are now running at like 60 frames per second instead of dropping below, which I think on PS4 Pro you're still looking at sort of around 45-50 on the cutscenes.
Yeah, I think the point is though, if it is better on Xbox One X, the average guy on the street probably won't be able to tell any real difference there.
No, it's not a massive upgrade. It's kind of, you do get an upgrade in some scenes, but in other scenes it's like, hang on a minute, it kind of looks very much the same.
Yeah,
so,
I think though, worth bearing in mind that both Pro and Xbox One X versions are a night and day improvement over the base Xbox One version. So there is an upgrade, it's just if you're looking for an upgrade compared to Pro, not really there from,
Exactly, yeah, whereas if you just got a base Xbox One, then,
Happy days.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so the next game we're going to take a look at, Skyrim. Now, I was kind of curious about this one going in because the PlayStation 4 Pro version is already native 4K, a locked native 4K. And then we saw the patch notes for the Xbox One X version. And yeah, Bethesda have actually gone for a 4K presentation, but it has a dynamic resolution scale. And it's like, why does a machine that in other titles has demonstrated big upgrades over Pro, why does it need to have a dynamic resolution scaler at all?
Yeah, exactly. And I actually found one point where it wasn't native 4K, and the interesting thing there is the dynamic resolution scaler. From what it looks like, it seems like the developers have incorporated it in order to make sure the game's hitting 30 frames per second. So on Pro, there are areas where you get a lot of volumetric fog, like the opening of the game, or sort of when the dragon's attacking the town, and performance can dip as low as 20 FPS at points. It doesn't happen very often, but at the same time you're not getting a locked experience. But on Xbox One X, those scenes actually run smoothly, 30 FPS. In one of those scenes, resolution dropped on the horizontal axis down to 2944 by 2160. So it's a horizontal scaling that's going on there, designed to basically make sure that performance is hitting that 30 FPS target you want. To be honest, I didn't really notice it when I was playing, the resolution dropping, because the temporary A means that everything's very smooth, there's no jaggies or anything like that, and the drops in resolution were like, a couple of seconds. It wasn't huge, and then we're back to native 4K again. But yeah. I think from my perspective, it was an identical visual experience except for better performance in those areas.
Yeah, I think this is fascinating because it's clearly the Pro that needs the dynamic scaler more than the Xbox One X version. And going back to when we first looked at Skyrim on PS4 Pro, I think our main gripe was that it ran slower than the base PS4 version of the game. And 1 year on, that hasn't been addressed. But it has in a way if you play it on Xbox One X. But at the same time, again, we're looking at the kind of differentials that we've seen elsewhere. And you kind of wonder why it needs a dynamic resolution scaler at all.
Yeah.
But there it is.
And you would have thought that extra settings from the PC game would have been nice with that extra power, maybe performance would have been impacted like to the same extent as on Pro, but with the Xbox One X, it seemed like an easy upgrade, but alas, we got something different.
Fixed resolution on Pro, dynamic on X, smoother performance on X. I'd rather play it on X, but it's not anything like the night and day improvement, and the majority of gameplay is the same.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Okay, next game, what do we got?
FIFA 18.
Yeah, FIFA 18.
Well, what can we say about this one? It's basically the same experience. Both consoles, both native 4K, both giving you that 60 FPS lock-in gameplay. I
think the bottom line is it's a good game on both systems. You get a bit of extra 3D grass on the X, don't you? Seems to be the one kind of upgrade that you do get. Not quite sure how that happened, but there it is. But yeah, the bottom line is there are a ton of games out there, not necessarily in AAA land, where the developer just has a singular vision for what they want to deliver, and they want that experience to be uniform on all systems. So, in the here and now, we're seeing, I would suggest, that X is being underutilized, but then, at the same time, equally, base PS4, you could argue that is being underutilized because the standard Xbox One version exactly the same pretty much.
Exactly, and even PC didn't get a massive boost over console, so I think in this case it is just a case of them targeting one specific baseline visuals that will run nicely on all the consoles and just adding a little extra where they can without sort of radically changing things.
Okay, so next game, Fortnite by Epic Games. Now this is an interesting one because on paper the X advantage is massively overwhelming, but we kind of get the idea that maybe the developer pushed too hard and, in certain modes it's to the detriment of gameplay.
Yeah, I think this one you've got a kind of an example where Xbox One X, you get a massive boost in resolution, more visual effects taken from the high-end PC experience, but performance kind of suffers in the most demanding modes as a result. So what we're looking at, I think PS4 Pro, we got native 1080p, with some of the enhanced settings from PC, whereas on Xbox One X it goes up to 1728p, so you get a massive boost in image quality. If you're playing on a 4K screen, you're actually going to benefit if you've got that sort of UHD TV screen. And on top of that, you get extra settings like high quality shadows and improved post-processing as well. So on paper it is a massive boost over Pro, and it looks a lot better. The downside is that performance when you're playing in like the tower defense mode, where you're sort of building a fort and having to gun down dozens of zombies, it can tank at points on Xbox One X, 20 frames, 25 FPS, versus I think PS4 Pro isn't 100% stable, does go just below 30, but more importantly is a lot closer.
Just plays better, I guess.
Yeah, it just plays better in that mode. Obviously not a problem in the Battle Royale mode, which is sort of less intense. That's kind of the player versus player 100 sort of man mode. That's spaced out on a big map, so you get a nice 30 FPS on both there. But yeah, I think it's a case of in the most demanding scenes, you've got the extra resolution, all those effects on Xbox One X, and maybe they're kind of stretching things a bit too much. Whereas on the Pro, I guess they kind of saw we can't push settings out as high or resolution up beyond 1080p in order to get performance close to that 30 FPS target.
Yeah, it's an interesting one there. 1728p is 80% on both axes there, so yeah, it's kind of below our preferred 1800p window, but it has got temporal anti-aliasing that holds up really nicely, and obviously compared to 1080p, it's a night and day improvement. But yeah, I kind of think the performance, a bit of a concern there. I'm not sure how that got out in that state, and that is one of the core modes of the game, the tower defense area.
Yeah, it is. That was the original mode they launched in the beta,
right?
And the Battle Royale just came out afterwards.
So final game, and another one that in theory should be a convincing Xbox One X win, Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, a patch for last year's COD title. And well, what do we got here?
Right, I was looking forward to this one. On PS4 Pro we had dynamic resolution using checkerboard rendering, so up to 2160p. On Xbox One X the checkerboarding looks to have been sort of ditched, so we're now looking at dynamic resolution but native, so when it goes to 2160p or 4K it is 4K rather than temporarily reconstructed.
So you do get a little bit of extra clarity in the imagery, but I think the point is that, well, you didn't really notice checkerboarding on the old PS4 Pro version of the game. Held up really nicely, very filmic looking presentation, very smooth, very soft. That persists onto Xbox One X. So the visual improvement you're getting from native rendering versus checkerboarding isn't immediately apparent, but more to the point, the Pro version runs more smoothly.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised about that. I know you do get the high quality depth of field and the improved draw distance on Xbox One X, but I didn't expect to see the boost to sort of native rendering resolution in the cases where it is going like to 4K, would see performance drops. But on Pro you're getting a mostly solid 60 FPS for the majority of the experience. It looks and feels great to play. But on Xbox One X I immediately noticed there was tearing that appeared at the top of the screen, but frame rates were kind of wobbling. They're not always bad drops, but if you're getting lots of little drops you get these stutters during gameplay, which you kind of notice because it's quite frequent. Even though it's not necessarily bad, it's still happening, it's not solid.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. I mean, Microsoft mandates that frame rates have to be better than base hardware or the same. And by that measure, it's absolutely fine, because the base Xbox One version of the game, performance really isn't that impressive at all. So yes, the Xbox One X version is a clear improvement over that. But at the same time, you've got the PS4 Pro version out there. May not be as impressive visually, but it's holding 60 frames per second much, much better overall. And it just kind of feels better, I think.
Yeah, that's definitely the case.
And the actual visual hit you get from the checkerboarding, not massively impactful to the experience.
Yeah, I mean, I only kind of would notice if you're looking at sort of still screens or sort of slow sort of panning shots where you're not running around. And most of the time you're running around shooting people, and you've got the temporal AA, all the post-processing. So any kind of sort of native sharpness you get is kind of going to be a bit undone by like the film grain and whatnot. So you do get an improvement, but in this case I feel that performance is something you're going to notice more often, because that affects the entirety of sort of the gameplay, how it looks and feels. whereas the resolution is kind of, it's a nice little bump in sharpness, but it's not a huge difference.
Yeah, I think what's been interesting from my perspective is, I mean, the first party stuff from Sony, you look at Horizon Zero Dawn, you look at GT Sport, they may be checkerboarding, they may not be native, but boy, they look good. And what I have noted is that, I don't know, third-party developers aren't so keen on checkerboarding. So, you know, Assassin's Creed Origins, native. They did experiment with checkerboarding. They didn't really like what it did to their pipeline, so they took it out. They went native. And obviously a lot of titles, Frostbite, that had checkerboarding in Battlefield 1 and Mass Effect Andromeda. It's not there in Battlefront 2. So yeah, I think there is the case that the Pro was kind of betting heavily on checkerboarding, but you know, developers aren't so keen on it. I mean, thinking about it, Q4 titles, Call of Duty World War II, Destiny 2, beyond that I'm struggling to think of many third-party games that are still using checkerboarding, and that was Sony's kind of gambit against, you know, having to deploy a massive GPU. So, you know, I think from my perspective, I think the Pro is still pretty awesome. I just think that in terms of delivering something that looks decent and really impressive on a 4K panel, third-party titles, you know, falling a bit short in some areas. First party's awesome.
Yeah, I get the feeling that if you want the 4K experience, then you're going to get it with all the first-party titles. But multi-platforms, 1440p often on the Pro, whereas Xbox One X, even if they don't have to sort of implement checkerboarding and sort of more exotic sort of temporal methods of reconstructing 4K, they can at least get a higher resolution bump than 1440p in most cases. So you will get that benefit from third-party games more on Xbox One X than on the Pro, which may be, depending on the title, a little bit disappointing.
Okay, well, I think we're going to leave it there. Please do like and subscribe to support what we do here at Digital Foundry. This is a full 4K video, so supporters of our Patreon can head over to digitalfoundry.net and grab the source file version of this video, and it will be a substantial upgrade over the YouTube version. But that's all from us for now. Thanks for this one, Dave.
No worries, Rich.
Okay, well, thanks for watching.